The needle slipped from Lydia Cooper's fingers the moment the stagecoach lurched hard to the left, sending her small sewing basket tumbling across the floor and scattering spools of thread like bright little planets spinning away from their sun. She was 24 years old, a seamstress from Cincinnati, Ohio, with steady hands and an unsteady future, and she had come west in the autumn of 1874 because there was nothing left in Ohio that could hold her. Her mother had passed in the spring, her father 2 winters before that, and the small dress shop she had worked at for 6 years had burned to the ground in July when the owner fell asleep with a candle burning too close to a bolt of silk. She had packed everything she owned into a trunk no bigger than a cedar chest, tucked her needles and thread into a basket lined with blue calico, and purchased a one-way ticket to Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, where a newspaper advertisement had promised steady work for a skilled seamstress in a growing frontier town. She had told herself it was a practical decision. She had told herself she was not afraid. She was absolutely afraid. The stagecoach rocked again, and Lydia pressed her palm flat against the wooden bench seat to steady herself. The other passengers, a portly merchant headed to Fort Laramie, and a woman with a sleeping infant who had barely spoken since Denver, seemed entirely unbothered by the lurching of the coach. Lydia gathered her spools from the floor, tucking them one by one back into the basket, and looked out the small window at the landscape unrolling outside. Wyoming in October was nothing like Ohio in October. Ohio had been golden and red, soft hills draped in maple and oak, smelling of wood smoke and apple cider. Wyoming was something else entirely. It was vast and bone-colored and magnificent in a way that made her chest tighten, the land stretching out to mountains so enormous they seemed painted against the sky rather than actually growing from the earth. The sky itself was a particular shade of blue she had no name for, deeper than cobalt and wider than anything she had ever witnessed. The stagecoach pulled into Laramie just as the sun began its long descent behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of orange and copper. Lydia climbed down from the coach with her trunk and her basket, standing in the middle of a street that smelled of horses and sawdust, and something cooking from somewhere nearby, and she breathed in slowly and told herself that she had made the right choice. The town was noisier than she expected and quieter than she feared. Men moved purposefully up and down the plank sidewalks in boots and broad-brimmed hats. A couple of cowboys rode past on big horses, their saddles creaking. A saloon at the end of the block leaked piano music and cigarette smoke into the evening air. Lydia picked up her trunk, which was heavier than was advisable for a woman of her slight build, and made her way toward the establishment marked with a painted sign that read Haverford's General and Provisions. The man inside, a Mr. Haverford, was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who seemed pleasantly surprised to see her. He had placed the advertisement, and he explained that his wife had recently taken ill and could no longer manage the sewing work that half the town relied on. He offered Lydia a small room above the store, reasonable wages for the mending and dressmaking he needed done, and the promise that there was more than enough work to keep her busy through the winter. Lydia accepted on the spot. She settled in quickly, as she always had, because she was a practical woman who did not believe in wasting time adjusting when there was work to be done. She set up her sewing space at the window of her small room where the light was best in the mornings, hung her spare dress on the peg by the door, and was at work the very next day with a pile of mending that Mrs. Haverford had left half-finished. The town warmed to her in the careful, measured way of frontier communities, which is to say people watched her for 2 weeks before they began to trust her, and then once they trusted her completely. She became a familiar figure on the main street. Women brought her dresses that needed letting out or taking in. Men brought her shirts with missing buttons and torn seams. And the wife of the local preacher commissioned a new dress for a Christmas social that was still 2 months away. It was during her 3rd week in Laramie that she first heard about Josiah Wallace. She heard his name the way she heard most things, which was by being present and paying attention, and not announcing herself too loudly. She was sitting at the counter of the general store with a basket of mended goods ready for pickup when two women came in together and began talking in the way women talked when they believed no one of consequence was listening. "Wallace came in from the mountains yesterday," the taller woman said, placing a sack of flour on the counter with a definitive thud. "6 months out this time. He looked half wild." "He always looks half wild," her companion replied with a fond sort of disapproval. "That man does not know what a proper haircut is for." "He bought enough provisions to last through February. Pelts to sell, as usual. Must have had a good season. He barely spoke to anyone, you know how he is." "I do know how he is. Garrett's boy tried to speak to him near the livery, and he just looked at the child like he had forgotten what children were." Both women laughed, the comfortable laughter of people discussing someone who was both respected and slightly beyond their understanding. Lydia absorbed this information without comment and filed it away, as she filed away most things that might prove useful later. A mountain man. Someone who came and went from the wilderness on his own terms and kept largely to himself. The frontier had men like that. She had read about them. Trappers and hunters and wanderers who had chosen the mountains over civilization and seemed perfectly content with that choice. She thought nothing more about it for 2 weeks. The day she finally met Josiah Wallace, she was in the general store sorting through a delivery of new fabric that Mr. Haverford had ordered from Denver, holding a length of deep green wool up to the window light to check its weight and weave, when the door opened and the room became somehow smaller. She felt it before she saw it, the particular compression of space that happens when someone very large enters a room that was not quite built to contain them. She turned, as anyone would, and she looked at him. He was enormous, not in the soft way of a man who ate well and did nothing, but in the dense, hard-won way of a man who had spent years in physical labor that most men would not survive. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to angle slightly to come through the door comfortably, and the coat he wore, heavy buffalo hide lined with something thick and dark, only made those shoulders appear more formidable. His arms, where the coat was pushed back at the wrists to accommodate the gloves he had folded over his belt, were ropey with muscle that moved visibly when he shifted the 2 bundles he was carrying. His chest was the kind of chest that made other men step slightly to the side without quite understanding why they had done it. His hair was a dark auburn brown, thick and somewhat long, curling just past his collar in the particular way of a man who cut it himself when it bothered him and otherwise left it alone. He had a jaw that could have been carved from the granite of the mountains he came from, darkened with several days of beard that was neither intentional nor accidental, but simply the result of being somewhere without a mirror. His eyes, when they landed on her, were a shade of gray-green that she had not anticipated, sharp and direct and carrying in them the particular quality of a man who had spent long months reading landscape and weather and animal behavior, and had accidentally become very good at reading people as a result. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he looked at most things in this store. "Haverford in?" he asked. His voice was low and measured, not the rumbling drawl she might have expected, but something more careful and considered. "He stepped out," Lydia said, and was mildly irritated to notice that her own voice sounded perfectly normal since she had expected it to come out smaller. "He should be back shortly. I can let him know you came in." "I'll wait," the man said. He set his bundles down by the door with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where to put things to stay out of everyone's way, and then he stood with his arms crossed and looked at the shelves the way he probably looked at mountain ridges, assessing, cataloging, patient. Lydia went back to her fabric. After a moment he said, without looking at her, "You're the seamstress." It was not a question. She folded the green wool carefully before answering. "I am Lydia Cooper." He looked at her again. "Josiah Wallace. I've heard your name." Something moved in his expression, the smallest adjustment, not quite amusement but close to it. "Nothing good, I expect. Only that you spend half the year in the mountains and come to town for provisions and leave again," she said honestly. "Nothing bad, just that you are a man who prefers his own company." He seemed to consider this as a fair summary. "Mostly accurate, Mr. Haverford returned then, and the conversation between the two men that followed was the efficient, transactional conversation of people who have a long-standing professional relationship, and no need to embellish it. Josiah bought a significant quantity of dried goods, ammunition, several yards of heavy canvas, a new skinning knife, and some medical supplies that he described without elaboration, and Mr. Haverford filled without question. He paid in coin, loaded his purchases into the saddlebags of the horse he had tied outside, and was gone within 20 minutes. Lydia watched him through the window as he rode out of town, heading north toward the mountains, and she told herself she was only watching because the horse was particularly impressive. She did not think about the gray-green eyes. She thought about them for the rest of the afternoon, but she told herself firmly that she was not. November came in cold and blustery, and the work in Lydia's little sewing room piled up in a satisfying way. She was good at her craft, genuinely good in the way of someone who had been doing it since childhood and who took a real pleasure in the precision of it. The way a well-placed seam could transform a piece of cloth from a flat thing into a shaped thing. The way the right thread color made the whole garment sing. She had begun to take on more ambitious projects as word spread about her skill, and a rancher's wife outside of town had commissioned an entire trousseau for her daughter who was to be married in the spring. The work kept her occupied and her mind orderly, which was what she needed. She had come here to build something new, and she was building it, stitch by careful stitch. She did not expect Josiah Wallace to come back in November. She had filed him away under the category of men who returned to town in spring, and was therefore surprised when he appeared in the general store on a gray Thursday afternoon looking somewhat more weathered than the last time, and carrying something wrapped in cloth that turned out, when Mr. Haverford asked, to be a badly torn piece of gear that needed mending. Mr. Haverford pointed at Lydia. Josiah Wallace walked over to her table and set the wrapped bundle down and unfolded it to reveal a large pack made of heavy canvas, intricately constructed, with several load-bearing seams that had given way entirely and one strap that had been tied in a knot so many times it was more knot than strap. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. Lydia picked it up and examined it with the same thoroughness she gave everything. She turned it over, found the weak points, noted the wear patterns that told her exactly how the thing had been used and where the stress had been highest. "Yes," she said, "all of it. The strap will need to be replaced entirely. Do you have a preference for the canvas weight?" He looked at her with that same sharp attention he had used the first time. "Heavier than what's there now. Mr. Haverford carries a 10-ounce and a 12-ounce. The 12 would be more than sufficient for what you're doing with this." He glanced at the pack and back at her. "You can tell what I'm doing with it. You're carrying significant weight over uneven terrain for extended periods," she said, pointing to the specific stress points that had given way. "The failure pattern is consistent. If we reinforce here and here with the heavier canvas, and replace the stitching throughout with a saddle stitch rather than a running stitch, it will last considerably longer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with that almost not quite amusement quality she was beginning to recognize, "All right." She repaired the pack over the next 2 days, working carefully and adding several improvements of her own devising that she thought might help, including a series of reinforced attachment points that could distribute the load more evenly and prevent the seam failures she had diagnosed. When he came back to collect it, she handed it to him and explained each modification briefly and practically, and he listened to every word with the full attention of someone who understood that details kept you alive in the mountains. He paid her, then looked at the pack for a moment longer than necessary, and then said, "You know your work." Coming from a man who she was fairly certain did not dispense compliments casually, this felt significant. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, tucked the pack under one arm, and started for the door. Then he stopped, which she had not expected, and turned back. "The winter gets hard here, Miss Cooper. Do you have sufficient firewood?" She blinked. It was such a practical question, and it was delivered with such genuine matter-of-factness that she was momentarily caught off guard by the degree to which it touched her. She had been managing entirely on her own for weeks, and no one had thought to ask. "Mr. Haverford provides," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Good," he said, and left. She stood at her table for a long moment after the door closed, her hand resting on the edge of her work table, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. The winter deepened, and Josiah made 3 more trips into town before December was done. Each time, he had something that needed repair. She began to suspect that the repairs were not always strictly necessary, because some of what he brought her could have been managed in the field with basic tools. But she did not mention this, and he did not explain himself. And so they settled into a rhythm of work and conversation that was careful and deliberate on both sides and deeply interesting to both of them, though neither would have admitted it aloud. He told her things about the mountains without being asked, the way the snow settled on the high passes and what it meant, how to read the behavior of elk and whether a storm was coming, where the best timber stood, and why the springs ran clear or cloudy depending on the season. He told her these things simply, in the way of someone sharing information they found genuinely remarkable and assumed you would too, and Lydia listened with her needle moving and her mind absorbing everything, asking questions that made him look at her with a new kind of attention. She told him about sewing, about the logic of fabric and structure, about how the same principles governed clothing that governed a tent or a sail or a harness, about the mathematics of fit and the artistry of cut, and he listened with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was total and unperforming, and asked questions that were direct and intelligent. By the time Christmas arrived, they had established something between them that neither had named and both were very aware of. The Christmas social that the preacher's wife had commissioned the dress for was held in the church hall on the 23rd of December. Lydia attended because Mrs. Haverford, who had recovered enough to be up and about, if not yet working, insisted. She wore her best dress, which was a deep burgundy wool she had made for herself in her first weeks here, simple and well cut and better than anything available in Laramie's single dry goods store. She did not expect to see Josiah Wallace at a church social, and yet there he was, standing at the far edge of the room with a mug of something warm in his hand, wearing a clean flannel shirt and trousers that were pressed with more precision than she would have expected, looking acutely uncomfortable with the indoor social situation, and somehow completely at ease within his own body simultaneously, which was a combination she found inexplicably compelling. He saw her within 30 seconds of her entering, because he always seemed to be aware of her presence in a room, which she had noticed and chosen not to examine too closely. He made his way across the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who was not going to be stopped but also was not in a rush, and when he reached her he said, "You look very fine, Miss Cooper." It was direct and unembellished, and her face warmed in a way she was grateful the lantern light could probably conceal. "Thank you, Mr. Wallace. You look considerably less like you've been sleeping in a snowbank." He smiled. It was not a small smile. It transformed his face, reached his eyes, made him look younger and warmer and somehow even more himself. "I made an effort," he said. "It shows," she said honestly. They stood together for most of the evening. They were not touching. They were maintaining every appropriate propriety, but they were orbiting each other in the way of two people who have decided, without saying anything, that the evening is more interesting when spent in each other's company. He fetched her cider when her mug was empty. She admired the dress she had made on Mrs. Preacher, who wore it beautifully, and Josiah stood beside her and said, "That's your work." And when she confirmed it, he looked at the dress with genuine respect for the craft. He danced with her once, when the musicians struck up something slower and several couples took the floor, and he danced with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned the steps and was executing them correctly rather than feeling them naturally, and she found this so endearing that she had to look slightly away to compose herself. His hand at her waist was large and warm through the wool of her dress. He held her with the same care he would have given something valuable, not constricting, just present, and she was aware of it for every second of the dance and for quite some time after. "Will you go back up soon?" she asked him as they walked out to the edge of the hall where the air was cooler. "After the new year," he said. "I have traplines to check and a few repairs to the cabin before the worst of the weather." "Is the cabin yours?" "Built it myself," he said. 5 years ago, took most of the summer." He paused. "It's a good cabin." She believed him completely. She could picture him building it, massive and methodical, reading the land and the timber, and doing the work with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. "I'm sure it is," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and there was something in them now that was less careful than usual, something that the warmth of the room and the cider and the violin music had permitted to surface. "I don't bring people there," he said slowly, as though he was surprising himself. "I haven't in all the time I've been here." She held his gaze. "That must be very peaceful," she said carefully. "It is," he said, and then, after a moment that held more weight than most, "Sometimes it's too quiet." She felt the admission in that statement, what it had cost him to say it, what he was telling her without saying it directly. Her heart was doing something entirely unauthorized, and she was having some difficulty looking away from him. "I understand quiet," she said softly. "I've been on my own for some time now. It has its advantages, but it also has its weight." "Yes," he said simply and fully. "It does." They did not say anything more about it that evening, but when he collected his coat at the end of the night and said goodbye to her, he held her hand a moment longer than a handshake required, and she stood in the cold air outside the church hall after he had walked away and looked up at the Wyoming stars, which were enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and thought that she had not felt this way about anyone, not about the young man from the printing house in Cincinnati. Not about the merchant's son who had courted her briefly and blandly 2 years ago. This was something different. This was specific and large and somewhat frightening, the way the mountains were large and specific and somewhat frightening, and she suspected, with the practical clarity she applied to most things, that it was probably not going to go away. January was brutal. The temperatures dropped to something that made the wind feel like a living thing with intentions, and the snow came in waves that left drifts against the buildings taller than Lydia's head. She remained largely inside, working by lamplight when the daylight ran short, and she had enough mending and dressmaking to keep her occupied. But she found herself thinking about the man in the cabin on the mountain in a way that was not orderly or practical. She thought about whether the repairs she had made to his pack were holding. She thought about whether his firewood supply was adequate. She thought about his hands, which were large and scarred and capable, and the particular way he had of listening to her when she spoke, as though what she said was the most interesting thing currently happening in his world. She thought about the dance. She thought about it more than was reasonable. February brought a thaw, brief and false as February thaws tend to be, and Josiah Wallace came down from the mountain on a gray Wednesday with a saddlebag full of furs to sell, and a new split in the shoulder seam of his heaviest coat that he said needed attention. Lydia fixed the coat while he waited, because he was leaving the next morning and it was not a repair that could be deferred, and while she worked he sat across from her on a stool that was slightly too small for him and drank the coffee she had offered, and they talked. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything and nothing, about the books she had brought west with her and the ones he had up at the cabin, about the way the mountains changed in different seasons, about Cincinnati and what she missed and what she did not, about why he had come to Wyoming in the first place, which turned out to be a story about a younger version of himself who had felt suffocated in St. Louis and had come west on a trapping season at 20 years old and simply never gone back. "Did you miss it?" she asked. "Your life before." He thought about it with the honesty he applied to everything. "I missed some of the people," he said. "Not many. The life itself, no. I was not built for it." He paused and a slight amusement crossed his face. "Some people are built for cities and some are built for open spaces. I learned which one I was fairly quickly." "And what does open space give you that cities cannot?" she asked, her needle moving steadily through the thick wool of his coat. He was quiet for a moment, not evading, thinking. "Everything is true in the mountains," he finally said. "There's no pretending out there. Weather is what it is, animals are what they are, a rock is a rock. You either know what you're doing or you don't. You can't talk your way out of a blizzard. And you find that preferable to uncertainty." "I find it honest," he said. "I like honest things." She looked up at him. He was already looking at her. The moment stretched between them, and she felt the same feeling she had felt at the Christmas social, the particular pull of something that wanted to be said but hadn't arrived yet. She finished the coat. He paid her. He sat for a few minutes longer than the transaction required, finishing his coffee, and then he stood and pulled on the coat, and it sat on his enormous shoulders exactly right, and she was aware that she was rather proud of that. "Thank you," he said at the door. "Come back safe," she said, and then felt immediately that she had revealed something. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, warmer and more open than usual. "I will," he said, and then he was gone. She stood at her window and watched him ride north, and when he was too small to see any more, she turned back to her work and sat down at her table and put her hand flat on the cool surface and breathed carefully. She was in love with him. It was inconvenient and wonderful and completely undeniable. She was in love with a mountain man who lived half the year in a cabin on the Wind River Range and talked to her about weather patterns and timber and the mathematics of fabric construction. And she did not know what to do about it except to keep working and keep being herself and trust that whatever this was, it was also happening on his side of things. She was fairly certain it was. The way he looked at her left very little room for uncertainty. March came slowly and then all at once, the way seasons changed in Wyoming, and with it came the particular restlessness of the territory, everyone moving, ranchers checking their range after winter, wagon trains beginning to gather in the east for the summer crossing, the town of Laramie itself seeming to stretch and shake off its cold weather quietude. Lydia had 2 new commissions arrive in the same week, both significant. A wealthy cattle rancher named Hendricks had a wife who wanted an entirely new wardrobe refitted for her change in weight following the birth of their second child, and the manager of the new hotel being built on 3rd Street wanted curtains and upholstery work throughout the entire establishment. Both projects would keep her busy for months, and both paid considerably more than she had earned in her first months here. She was in the middle of measuring fabric for the hotel curtains when the door of the general store opened, and Josiah walked in. She had not expected him until April at the earliest. He looked exactly as he always did when he came down from the mountains, larger and more elemental than the town seemed to know how to hold, but there was something different in his face today, something that looked like purpose carried beyond its usual level. "I thought you were staying through April," she said, because the surprise came out before she could arrange herself. "I came down for a reason," he said. He was carrying nothing except his coat and his hat, which he had removed, and he was holding the hat in both hands in a way that, on any other man, she would have called nervous. On Josiah Wallace, she chose to call it deliberate. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am perfectly well," he said. He looked at her directly the way he always did, but more so. "Miss Cooper, Lydia, I would like to speak plainly if you will permit me." Her hand, still holding the length of curtain fabric, had gone still. "Of course," she said. He breathed in through his nose, a brief, steadying thing. "I have been in these mountains for 5 years, and before that I was in Missouri for 23, and I have never in all of that time walked into a room and felt the room change," he said. "I am not a man who uses words carelessly, so I want you to understand that what I am saying is something I have thought about with full seriousness." He paused. "I think about you when I'm up there, considerably more than I would if you were simply someone who mended my gear." Another pause. "I am not good at this. I want to be honest with you about that. I'm much better at building things and reading weather and keeping myself alive in difficult conditions than I am at speaking about what I feel. But I have found over these past months that what I feel for you is too significant to be managed by silence." The curtain fabric was pooling on the floor. She had completely forgotten it was in her hands. "I am not offering you anything easy," he continued, his voice steady as stone. "A life connected to mine is not a conventional life. There are long periods of cold and isolation and work that most people would find unendurable. I spend half the year in a place that is genuinely difficult to reach. I am not a polished man, and I cannot offer you the comforts of city life." He looked at her steadily. "But I am offering you me, entirely and without reservation, if you would consider accepting that." Lydia set the fabric down on the table and walked around to the front of it and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up at him considerably, which she did not mind. He was watching her with that complete attention of his, the gray-green eyes steady and clear, and there was something very open in his face, something that had made itself vulnerable in the saying of those words and was now simply waiting. "Josiah," she said, "I have been in love with you since at least December." The breath he let out was something she felt more than heard. The tension in his massive shoulders released in a way that was almost visible, and what replaced it was something warm and real, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his with a carefulness that contradicted entirely the size of those hands. He held it the way you held something that mattered. "I did not know," he said, which was slightly incredulous. "I did not say," she replied. "Why not?" "Because I was waiting for you," she said honestly, "and I thought you needed to be ready." He looked at her for a long moment and then laughed, a full and genuine laugh she had not heard from him before, low and warm and entirely delightful. "You were managing me," he said. "I was being patient," she corrected, and she was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. He brought her hand up, her small seamstress's hand with its calluses and needle-prick scars, and he pressed his mouth to her knuckles in a gesture so unexpectedly tender from a man so physically formidable that it made her throat tight. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." "I will allow it," she said. He came to town every 2 weeks through the spring, which was a more frequent schedule than she suspected his traplines technically required, and she did not comment on this because she was wise enough to accept the gifts that life offered without interrogating the logistics. He took her for dinner at the hotel restaurant on 2 occasions, which involved him wearing a clean shirt and enduring the indoor social situation with better grace than she expected, because she had noticed that he endured things with better grace when she was there than when she was not. He brought her things from the mountains, a bunch of early wildflowers once, bright against the snow, and once a piece of quartz shot through with threads of something golden that he said he had found near the spring and thought she would like. She kept the quartz on her work table where she could see it. He was not a man given to excessive words, but the words he chose for her were careful and specific and always meant. He told her, on a May evening when they were walking along the edge of town in the last of the light, that he had never before understood why men built houses rather than cabins, because a cabin was sufficient for one person and what more could you want, but that recently he had started to understand it. She understood exactly what he meant and felt the warmth of it settle all through her. He told her, on another occasion, that she was the most capable person he had met in Wyoming, and he specified that he meant this as the highest possible compliment because he had met some very capable people in Wyoming, and the competition was genuine. She told him, on a warm June evening on the porch of the general store, that she was happy, that she had come west out of necessity and found, unexpectedly, something she had not known to look for, that she woke up in the mornings looking forward to the day in a way she had not done in Cincinnati, even before all the losses, because there was a sense here of possibility that was native to the frontier. He listened to this with his arms resting on the porch railing and his face turned toward her in the evening light, and when she finished he said, quietly, "I'm glad you came west." "So am I," she said. He asked her to marry him in July. He had not gone back to the mountains since May, which she had noticed, and about which Mr. Haverford had made one pointed comment, and subsequently thought better of. He had been in town or near it, doing various work that Laramie needed and that he was extremely well suited to provide, repairing fences for the ranchers and helping frame the new livery stable, and doing various things that kept him near enough to see her regularly without being so present as to be inappropriate. The proposal happened in the evening, on the bank of the small creek that ran behind the eastern edge of town, where they had taken to walking on warm evenings, because it was quieter there, and neither of them were particularly suited to the busy main street on hot summer nights. He had brought a blanket and the remains of the supper she had packed, and they were sitting in the cooling air with the creek running quietly and the sky going deep blue overhead, and he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring. It was not a jeweler's ring. It was something he had made himself. She could see that immediately, a band of silver that had been worked and shaped with surprising skill, set with a small piece of that same gold-threaded quartz he had given her months ago, ground smooth, and set with a precision that spoke to many hours of patient work. He held it out to her in his palm. "I made this in April," he said, which told her something she filed immediately under the category of things that made her heart fully ache. He had decided in April. "Josiah," she said. "I know what I want," he said. "I have known for some time. I am asking if you want it too." She looked at the ring in his enormous palm, at the care worked into every detail of it, and she looked up at him, at the direct gray-green eyes and the honest face, and the whole vast landscape of this man who had come down from his mountain and chosen her with the same deliberate certainty he brought to everything in his life. "Yes," she said. "Completely yes." He put the ring on her finger with the same carefulness he had used when he held her hand the first time, and then he drew her in against his side with a tenderness that was the other side of all that strength, and she rested against him in the summer evening with the creek sounding and the first stars appearing overhead, and she thought that it was remarkable how a person could come to a place that was nothing like home and build something that felt more like home than anything they had left behind. The wedding was planned for September, which gave her 6 weeks to finish the Hendricks wardrobe commission and complete enough of the hotel work to justify the time she would need for her own trousseau and the wedding garments. She was making her own dress, of course. She had strong opinions about her own dress. She made it from cream-colored wool, heavier than silk but warmer and more practical for a September Wyoming wedding, with a fitted bodice that she was particularly pleased with and a skirt that moved beautifully when she walked. She embroidered the cuffs and the hem with small details in gold thread, flowers and leaves, and a few geometric patterns that she took from the quartz stone on her work table, tiny referenced shapes that Josiah would never notice and that she would always know were there. He saw the dress for the first time at the wedding, which was the tradition, and she came into the church on the arm of Mr. Haverford, who had offered himself for the role with gruff warmth when it became clear there was no family to perform it, and she walked up the aisle of the small Laramie church toward Josiah Wallace, who stood at the front with the look of a man who was confronting something he had waited for and was only now understanding the full reality of. He was wearing a suit. She had not known he owned a suit. It was dark wool, and it fit him in the way that clothes had to be specifically constructed to fit a man with shoulders that wide, and she suspected he had visited a tailor in Cheyenne at some point without mentioning it. He had cut his hair, not entirely. It still curled past his collar because she had told him once that she liked it that way, but it was neat and deliberate. He had shaved. He looked extraordinary and entirely like himself, and like a man who was standing at the altar of a church in Wyoming territory, understanding with full clarity that his life was about to change and welcoming every part of it. When she reached him and took his hand, he looked at her for a long, still moment and then said, very quietly, just for her, "You are the finest thing I have ever seen in my life." She held onto her composure by the thinnest possible thread. The ceremony was simple and direct, which suited both of them, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Josiah kissed her for the first time, It was in the particular way of someone who had thought about it for months and had finally arrived, deliberate and certain and very, very warm. The small crowd in the church made considerable noise. They had 2 nights in Laramie in the room she had been renting, which Mrs. Haverford had decorated with great enthusiasm and some ribbon while they were at the ceremony. And then on the third day Josiah loaded a horse with her trunk and her sewing basket and the box of supplies she had carefully prepared, and they rode north toward the mountains. She had known she was going. They had talked about it thoroughly, the way they talked about everything, practically and honestly and without pretense. She would come to the cabin with him, at least for the first winter, and they would determine together what arrangements made the most sense for their life going forward. She had spoken to Mr. Haverford about the possibility of continuing some work when she came to town for supplies, which he had welcomed, and she had finished enough of her outstanding commissions to leave with a clear conscience. She had never been this far from a town in her life. She had never been on a horse for more than 30 minutes at a stretch, and the first day of riding left muscles aching that she had not known she possessed. Josiah was patient and attentive in a way that was entirely practical, adjusting her stirrups and her posture and explaining things about the horse's behavior and the terrain with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness he had always brought to everything. He checked on her regularly without making it feel like hovering, because he had an instinct for the line between care and condescension that she had never had to explain to him. The mountains in September were extraordinary. She had thought she understood the landscape from the views she had from Laramie, but being inside the mountains was entirely different from looking at them. The light here was a specific quality, clear and thin at altitude, making everything sharp and particular. The smell of pine and cold stone and clean water was something she could not have prepared herself for. The sound of the wilderness, which was not silence but a complex and layered absence of human noise, was initially disorienting, and then, gradually, deeply settling. The cabin was everything he had said it was. It sat in a shallow valley with a spring nearby and a south-facing aspect that caught the best of the winter sun, built from the local timber with a precision and solidity that reflected exactly the character of the man who had built it. It was one large room with a stone fireplace that was excellent. She could tell immediately, because the draw was perfect and the heat distributed well. There was a sleeping loft, a work table, shelves that he had made himself lined with a careful selection of supplies and books and tools. There were pegs for coats and hooks for gear, and a window on the east wall where the morning light came in clean and direct. He watched her look around it with the specific attentiveness of someone who has brought a person to a place that matters and is waiting to see how they respond. She turned to him and said, "It's a very good cabin." He smiled, slow and warm. "I told you." She organized her sewing things at the work table, which was large enough for her purposes, and put the piece of quartz on the sill of the east window where the morning light would hit it. She hung her spare dress on a peg and arranged her books alongside his on the shelf, and when she stepped back and looked at the room it looked different, not less his, but both of theirs simultaneously. He watched her do all of this, and there was something in his face throughout that she could not entirely articulate, except that it looked like a man who was discovering that the word home had more dimensions than he had previously appreciated. The autumn at the cabin was unlike anything she had experienced. She learned things that would have been entirely foreign to her Cincinnati self: how to properly bank a fire for overnight, how to read the clouds for incoming weather, which plants near the spring were useful and which to leave alone, how to manage the small details of life at altitude when the nearest neighbor was half a day's ride away. She was not a quick learner in the way of someone who picked things up effortlessly. She was a careful learner, the way she had always been, who made sure of each thing before moving to the next. Josiah taught her without impatience, explaining things fully and allowing her to do them herself rather than doing them for her, which was the exact right approach, because she was a person who needed to understand things through her own hands. She continued to sew. She had brought enough work to keep her occupied for months, and the lamplight at the cabin table was adequate for fine work if she positioned herself correctly. She made herself a pair of heavy wool trousers for warmth, which raised no eyebrows here because there was no one to raise eyebrows, and she made them with a precision that Josiah watched with genuine admiration. She made repairs to his gear that went beyond what was strictly necessary because she could see ways to improve things, and she could not help improving things she could see how to improve. He began teaching her to shoot in October. Not because the wilderness was as dangerous as people in town imagined, he told her honestly, but because it was a practical skill that could on occasion be the difference between a bad situation and a recovered one, and because the weapon he chose for her, a smaller caliber rifle that she could handle comfortably, was useful for things beyond defense. She was not a natural shot, but she was systematic, and within 3 weeks she could reliably hit what she was aiming at from a standing position, which he said was more than many people achieved. He was proud of her in the way he was proud of everything she did, without making a production of it, simply noting it as fact and moving on. She found this extremely satisfying. She had spent years in Cincinnati being faintly patronized by people who found it surprising when a seamstress demonstrated competence outside of stitching, and Josiah seemed genuinely incapable of surprise at her capabilities, as though he had simply assessed her in the beginning and concluded she was competent, and that conclusion remained standing regardless of what she did. She loved him more deeply each week. It was not the dazzling, destabilizing love of the first months, though traces of that remained. This was something that had roots, that was interwoven with the daily fabric of shared life in a specific place. She loved the way he moved through his own spaces, efficient and unhurried. She loved the way he talked in the evenings when the fire was built up and they were inside against the dark and cold. The way he was willing to follow a thought wherever it went and to disagree with her directly and without aggression when he saw things differently. She loved the way he slept, entirely still, like a man who was at complete peace with where he was. She loved his hands, which she had loved since nearly the beginning, and the way they were calibrated to both enormous tasks and delicate ones, because he could mend a fence or repair a snare, or, when she had a headache one cold November afternoon, press his thumbs against her temples with a gentleness so controlled it made her breath catch. He told her once, in the particular honesty of the winter dark, that he had been afraid she would find the mountain life too isolating, that the long stretches of just the two of them and the sky and the wilderness would be something she merely endured rather than lived. She told him truthfully that she had been more lonely in Cincinnati with a city full of people around her than she was here, and that the distinction between being alone and being lonely was something she had understood for a long time, and that here she was neither. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Neither am I," and the weight of what that meant for a man who had lived alone for 5 years in these mountains was something she understood completely. They came down to Laramie in December for supplies and Christmas, spending 4 days in town, staying in the room that Mrs. Haverford had designated as theirs with the particular proprietary hospitality of a woman who had decided she cared about both of them. Lydia saw her clients, took new commissions she would work on through the winter, visited with the women she had come to know in her year in the town, and felt the curious double nature of herself in each context, the seamstress of Laramie and the mountain man's wife of the high country, and found that both of these were simply her. A ranch wife named Helen Garrett, who had become something of a friend over the course of the year, took her aside at the Christmas social and said very directly, "Are you happy, Lydia? Honestly." "Honestly," Lydia said, and she smiled with everything in her face, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." Helen looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of a good friend and then nodded, satisfied. "You look it," she said, "and he looks at you like you hung the moon and the stars both." Lydia glanced across the room to where Josiah was standing with a group of ranchers, doing his best with the indoor social situation. And at exactly that moment he looked over at her, the way he always eventually looked toward wherever she was in a room, and the expression on his face when he found her was something she thought she could sustain herself on for a lifetime. "He rather does," she said softly. They were back on the mountain by New Year's Day, watching the year turn in the quiet of the cabin with the fire bright and the snow deep outside, and it was perfect. The winter passed with that particular mix of long quiet and sudden urgency that characterized mountain life. There were storms that kept them inside for days, during which they talked and read and she sewed, and he worked on a project she chose not to examine too closely because she suspected it was something he intended to give her. There were clear, cold days that were so beautiful they both went outside simply to look at the world, the snow and the pines and the sky, and the silence that was not silence but everything alive in its winter register. In February, she told him she thought she might be expecting. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes, and then he sat down, which was not something she saw him do suddenly very often, and then he stood back up and crossed the cabin in 2 steps and put his arms around her in the careful, encompassing way he had, the way that always made her feel both sheltered and held, and he pressed his face against the top of her hair and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" This was so entirely Josiah, so completely him, the immediate practical care preceding everything else, that she felt her eyes sting in a way that had nothing to do with unhappiness. "I feel well," she said, somewhat tired, pleased. "We'll go down in March," he said, "to see the doctor." "April is soon enough," she said, because she was a practical woman and she had done her reading. "I'm fine, Josiah." He pulled back to look at her face with the same attentiveness he gave weather and terrain, and everything that mattered to him. He searched her eyes and found, apparently, the honesty and well-being she was expressing, and some of the tension in him released. "April," he agreed. But he watched her more carefully after that, in the way she had come to understand meant not hovering but simply keeping account of things he cared about. The something he had been building in his project corner turned out, that March, to be a cradle. He had made it from the same local timber as the cabin, shaped and sanded until it was smooth and light and beautiful, with small carved details along the sides, leaves and mountains, and one small figure that she turned in her hands for a long time before she identified it as a woman with a sewing basket. She held the cradle in both hands and looked at the small carved woman for a long time and did not say anything because she could not at that moment. And Josiah stood with his arms at his sides in the patient way of someone waiting without pressure. And eventually she looked up at him and said, "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." And she meant it with every part of herself. "She has your posture," he said, indicating the small carved figure. And the way he said it, with that almost amusement and the warmth beneath it, made her laugh through the tightness in her throat. They went down to Laramie in April, and the doctor confirmed what they already knew and told them she was in excellent health, and the baby was expected in the late summer. Josiah was courteous and attentive throughout this appointment in the way that he was capable of being, which was the way of someone applying full concentration and good manners simultaneously. And the doctor, a practical man named Summers who had been practicing on the frontier for 15 years, gave him a look of frank approval when Lydia was not watching. Mrs. Haverford immediately began knitting. Helen Garrett organized a gathering of the women Lydia knew in town, and they spent an afternoon together making small garments and giving advice. And Lydia sat in the warmth of this community. She had built one interaction at a time and felt the fullness of it. They had to make the decision about where she would be when the baby came. It was not a simple decision. Josiah wanted her in town where the doctor was accessible. She understood this and did not dismiss it. They talked about it with the honesty they brought to everything and arrived at a plan that satisfied them both. She would come down to Laramie in late July and stay through the birth and the first weeks, and then they would return to the mountain when she and the baby were strong enough for the journey. He would not leave her in town alone. This was not a negotiation. He said it simply and flatly. The one time she suggested he might go back up to manage his traplines, and she could manage in town with Mrs. Haverford's help, and the look on his face was so completely immovable and so entirely without anger, and so fully grounded in the simple fact of what he valued most that she did not suggest it again. They spent the summer months at the cabin, coming down to town 3 times for supplies and doctor visits, and in late July they came down and stayed. Josiah occupied himself in ways that kept him useful without driving anyone to distraction. He fixed things that needed fixing around town, helped the Haverfords with some structural repairs to the back of the store, and checked on Lydia with a frequency and care that Mrs. Haverford declared was the most considerate behavior she had ever witnessed from a man of any kind, city or mountain. The baby came in August, a boy, arriving with the full dramatic energy of someone who had decided the world would know about his arrival, and Josiah was present throughout in a way that the doctor noted afterward was unusual, and that Mrs. Haverford declared was entirely correct. When the doctor placed the baby in Josiah's enormous hands, the look on Josiah's face was something Lydia watched from the bed and held in her memory as one of the most remarkable things she had ever seen in her life. The tenderness and the wonder of it, the specific texture of a man who had built his life on strength and solitude suddenly holding this small new thing, was almost more than she could account for. "He's very small," Josiah said carefully. "They are at first," Dr. Summers said with professional equanimity. "He is entirely whole," Josiah said, as if confirming this to himself, running one careful thumb over the baby's hand in a gesture so gentle it seemed impossible from hands that size. "All 10 fingers," Lydia confirmed from the bed, her voice tired and warm and full. Josiah looked up at her with those gray-green eyes, and she had never seen him look like this, unguarded and overwhelmed in the best possible way, like a man who has encountered something larger than himself and is not frightened by it but simply astonished. "Lydia," he said and stopped. "I know," she said. They named him Thomas, for no sentimental reason except that it suited him, and Thomas turned out to be a child of forceful opinion and excellent lungs, who expressed both qualities freely in his first weeks of life. Josiah learned to manage night waking with the same systematic approach he brought to every new skill, getting up without complaint and pacing the cabin floor with Thomas against his chest, in the small hours with a patience that she watched with quiet wonder from the bed, occasionally staying awake simply to observe the two of them together in the lamplight, the enormous man and the small, fierce baby, the mountain and the new thing growing on it. Thomas was 8 weeks old when they went back to the mountain in October, the wagon loaded with additional supplies for a longer winter, the cradle carefully packed and padded, Lydia strong and easy in the saddle again. She had spent 6 weeks in town and was ready, entirely ready, for the particular piece of the high country. The cabin that she had first seen in September of the previous year was hers now in a way that was complete. She had hung curtains she had made at the east window. She had put up shelves for her thread and tools. She had added a braided rug near the fireplace that had taken her most of the winter to make and was very fine. The cabin was still Josiah's in its bones, which were good bones, but it breathed with both of them now, and with Thomas in his cradle near the fire it was something she had no sufficient word for except whole. The years that followed were full and real in the way of good lives, which are not uncomplicated but are deeply inhabited. Thomas grew into a child of remarkable curiosity, and his father's physical confidence, toddling through the cabin with the certainty of someone who owned the space and later following Josiah on his rounds with the dogged persistence of a pup, absorbing everything his father did by observation and repetition. Lydia taught him his letters early, because she was not a woman who believed in waiting on education, and he learned them with the same systematic approach he applied to everything, which was clearly inherited. When Thomas was 2, Lydia became expecting again, and this time the waiting was different because she knew what was coming and who would come, and the preparatory emotions were joy without the previous undertow of uncertainty. She came down to Laramie again when the time approached and Josiah was there again, and this time the baby was a girl, arriving with considerably less drama than her brother, but with a particular quality of watchful attention from her very first hours that made the doctor say she had the most alert eyes he had seen on a newborn in 20 years. They named her Clara, and from her earliest weeks she watched the world with an intensity that reminded Lydia of someone, though she did not say so for several months until Josiah, looking down at his daughter during a quiet afternoon, said, "She looks at things the way you look at things." And Lydia said, "I know." And the satisfaction of this was something they shared without needing to elaborate. Thomas was passionately interested in Clara for approximately 4 days, and then decided she was mostly boring and returned to his outdoor activities, though he showed a quiet possessiveness about her that Lydia noticed, and that became more apparent over the years as Clara's watchful intelligence began to manifest in ways that Thomas felt required older brother interpretation to the world. They settled into the rhythm of their particular life, which was not like most lives, and suited them exactly. Josiah continued to trap and hunt through the seasons, the work of the mountains that had always been his, and Lydia continued her sewing, which had evolved beyond the practical work of the early years into something closer to an artistry. She took commissions when they came to town. She did the fine work that the best clients in Laramie now sought her out for specifically, and she continued to find in the craft the same deep satisfaction she had always found there, the making of ordered beauty from raw material, the translation of an idea in the mind into a thing in the world. She came to town regularly enough to maintain her friendships and her professional connections. Helen Garrett, who had become over the years something close to a sister, remained a constant in her life. Mrs. Haverford, who had fully recovered and was considerably more vigorous than her illness had suggested she might be, took a proprietary interest in the entire Wallace family that all 4 of them had accepted with various degrees of amusement and affection. Josiah, over the years, became something in the community that was different from what he had been when she arrived. He was still not a man who sought company or found social situations particularly natural, but the marriage and the family and the years of reliable presence had embedded him in the town's life in a way he had not been before. People came to him with things that needed the particular combination of strength and competence and absolute reliability that he provided. He helped without making a fuss about it. He was known and trusted, and in the specific economy of frontier trust, this was worth a great deal. He continued to look at Lydia, across rooms and across fires and across years, with the expression that Helen Garrett had described as a man who believed his wife hung the moon and the stars, and Lydia continued to find this expression, which she knew as well as she knew every other detail of his face, the most welcome thing in any room. There was a September morning when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 3, a blue and gold Wyoming morning with the aspen turning on the slopes and the air carrying its first real edge of coming cold, when Lydia came out of the cabin with her coffee and found Josiah sitting on the step in the early light, the 2 children beside him and slightly in front of him, all 3 of them looking at something in the trees that she could not see from the doorway. She watched them from the door for a moment. Thomas was still and intent, which was unusual for Thomas. Clara was leaning very slightly against her father's arm in the particular way she had, not asking for attention, but accepting the warmth of proximity. Josiah's hand was on Thomas's shoulder in a loose, easy way. He heard her in the doorway. He always heard her, and turned his head, and his face in the morning light was everything she had been given in these years, the strength and the honesty and the warmth and the love that was all the more remarkable for how unexpected it had been on both sides. "There's a fox," he said quietly, so as not to disturb whatever was happening in the trees. "With Kits. She's been denning near the spring." Lydia came and sat on the step beside him, close against his side, and he moved his arm to make space for her the way he always did, naturally and without thinking, as though making room for her was simply the automatic adjustment of a man who had organized himself entirely around her presence. She could not see the fox in the trees. She looked at the aspen and the slope and the sky above the ridge, which was the particular blue she had still never found a name for in all her years in Wyoming. "Do you ever think about going back east?" she asked, not because she wanted to, but because she wondered sometimes about the asking of it. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "No," he said, "not even occasionally." "No," he said again, and the simplicity of it was complete. He looked down at her with those gray-green eyes. "Do you?" She thought about Cincinnati, the dress shop ashes, the small apartment, the loneliness she had managed so thoroughly she had mostly stopped noticing it. She thought about the stagecoach ride into Laramie and the feeling of looking out at these mountains for the first time and understanding, distantly, that she was looking at something that would hold her. "No," she said. Thomas, without looking away from the trees, said, "I see her. She has 3 Kits." "4," Clara said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had counted carefully. There was a moment of sibling tension, and then Thomas leaned forward to look again and said, "4," with the particular grace of a boy who had been taught by example that being wrong is not the same as being lesser. Josiah pressed his mouth briefly against the top of Lydia's hair, warm and unhurried, the gesture of a man for whom this was the natural expression of how he felt rather than a performance of it. She held her coffee mug in both hands and leaned into him and watched the aspen move and the sky brighten and her children count fox Kits in the quiet morning. And she thought about the woman who had boarded a stagecoach in Denver with a sewing basket and a one-way ticket, and a practical decision that had turned out to be the best decision of her life. She had come west as a seamstress. She had arrived with her needles and her thread and her careful, orderly, capable self, and she had found in this place a life she had not known to want, built from the things she already was, and the things she had become in the finding of a man who valued exactly those things. She had come west a seamstress and become someone's most treasured wife, which was not a diminishment of the seamstress but an addition to her, a room added to a house that was already good, making it better. She had come west alone and would never be alone again. Josiah shifted beside her, just the small adjustment of his weight, the unconscious settling of a man entirely at ease in his own life, and the warmth of him was the warmth of the fire he built, and the cabin he had made and the years he had given her. She turned her face up to the morning and closed her eyes for one moment, the sun coming over the ridge and landing on her skin like something it had been meaning to say for years. Thomas said from the step below, "Mama, are you sleeping?" "No," she said, "I am thinking." "About what?" he asked, with the direct curiosity of a 5-year-old who finds the interiority of adults both interesting and somewhat suspicious. She opened her eyes and looked at the slope and the trees and the blue sky, and she smiled. "About how fortunate we are," she said. Clara, who had inherited her father's quality of saying the precise thing, turned and looked at her mother, and then at her father with the watchful eyes that had been watchful since birth, and said simply, "Yes." Josiah laughed, low and warm and entirely real, and Lydia felt it all through her, the laugh and the morning and the mountain and the irreplaceable specific weight of this life that had been built from a practical decision, and a piece of gold-threaded quartz, and a man with gray-green eyes who had walked into a general store one November afternoon and changed the temperature of the room. She was home. She had been home for years. She would be home, in this specific way and no other, for all the years that remained to her. And she counted each one of them, as she counted her stitches, as something made by hand and made to last. The fox, when she finally appeared at the tree line, was small and red and entirely unconcerned with the family watching from the cabin step. and her 4 kits tumbled after her into the morning in the abundant, unperforming way of things that are simply alive and going about the work of being alive. And the valley held them all, the fox and the kits and the children and the man and the woman who had come west with a sewing basket and left as something she had never expected and always, in some deep and wordless place, been waiting to become.